volunteer who is willing to read our opening verses here tonight?
I will. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread throughout all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of the sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor."
All right, great. Thank you for that reading. Okay, just to kind of context remind us where we are. We've traveled through actually three sections now of the Gospel of Luke. The very first one is that kind of preface, prologue section, 4 verses, smallest one in the entirety of Luke. Second one are the infancy narratives, and then third one that we just completed last week is the preparation for ministry. So makes sense then, right? We're literally like Jesus is kind of publicly launching his ministry here. One thing that I don't have on the outline here, just so that you know, is that, chapter 4 up to about chapter 9 constitutes its own section, which is typically called the Galilee ministry section. So this is a section where Jesus is public, he's doing his work, but he's obviously operating in his kind of home region, which is also kind of a backwoods region. And also, not unimportantly, is a region where there are some definite areas of Gentile mixture. And so the Galilee would certainly have been looked down upon by people in Jerusalem. They would have seen it as a backwater area. But the more astute who kind of knew what was going on in the region would have even had maybe a darker vision, in the sense that they would have seen it as a place that was fundamentally unclean to a certain extent, because there are areas in the Galilee that are dominated by Gentiles. So we just want to kind of keep that in mind as sort of the backdrop of what's going on here. The second thing we want to say, kind of now we're sort of jumping into the outline as it is before you, is of course that chapter 4 verses 16 up to 30, it all hangs together, right? This is sort of the inauguration scene of Jesus's ministry. We have a couple of verses prior to that. I'll make a couple of comments about that in just a second, but because this is sort of the beginning, in a sense, of Jesus's ministry, and essentially he kind of launches it under the banner of this text from Isaiah, it has of course drawn a lot of attention, and you would expect it to do so, because as is typically the case when you're kind of launching something, and this is certainly would be the case in the Gospels, when you're sort of starting out with something and you frame it according to a particular vision or a particular sense of mission, then that's probably going to give you some clues about what you're going to find later. And that certainly is the case as we kind of move through Jesus's ministry. We've only read the first half of the story, which is actually pretty amazing if you think about it. And I really do want to kind of emphasize that, to hear these verses, and then in just a second to hear Jesus say these verses are fulfilled in your midst, it would be kind of a really heady kind of situation to be in. And so just keep that kind of in mind as we're moving through. And one of the reasons why I want to keep that in mind too is the starkness eventually of the response of the crowd, which sets up a key element in the story of Jesus, which is the tension around the good news that Jesus proclaims and the controversy that it creates. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. All right, so verses 14 through 15 then precede the public inauguration. We get then, right, it says, then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by by everyone. So here we have an interesting link back to the temptation narrative, which was the kind of the concluding portion of the preparation section, which is the Spirit driving Jesus out into the wilderness to face temptation, the 40 days and the 3 temptations that we spent time kind of carefully going through last week. Here, of course, at the end, Jesus is, of course, marked by the power of the Spirit. And if you remember, the power of the Spirit being marked by that power indicates also a prophetic element, right? That Jesus is a prophetic figure along with all the other elements that he comes to inhabit, like being a messianic figure, etc. It, of course, also foreshadows to a certain extent what we might, consider the showdown that happens eventually in the synagogue, right? Jesus is driven by the Spirit into the wilderness to face the conflict. He's also, to a certain extent, driven by the Spirit into the synagogue in his hometown, where eventually he's going to face a conflict. So there's a kind of parallel at work there that we don't necessarily want to lose. It's very interesting, of course, that Luke says here in verse 15, he began to teach in synagogues and was praised by everyone. This stands, it's, it's almost kind of a throwaway verse in a sense, but it stands in marked contrast to the very next scene in which Jesus is in a synagogue and they're speaking well of him, but then by the end of the scene, they're ready to throw him off a cliff. And so I just want to keep help us keep in mind sort of some of the contrasts that are being developed here by Luke, and that will kind of play themselves out not only in this scene, but as we move forward in Jesus' life. So in verse 16, which also in some ways flows straight out of 15, when he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom, and he stood up to read. So verse 16, just one observation, and again, it flows out of 15, and that's simply that whatever we want to say about Jesus, whatever we want to say in terms of the radicalism that he stood for, the uniqueness of Jesus over against his peers, he's also in some ways a conventional Jew. He's a pious Jew. Where is he going to teach? He's going to teach first and foremost in the synagogue, right? So he's a pious Jew, just like his parents, right? And if you remember, we talked about with his parents, we talked about also with the parents of John the Baptist. And I think this is an interesting element that's at play. Like if we decide, and we decide that we agree that one of the underlying sort of agendas of Luke is to help people understand that Gentiles who are being brought into the church, and remember Luke is writing, some 50, 60 years after the life, death, resurrection of Jesus, depending on when we want to kind of precisely date the production of the Gospel of Luke. At that point, though, many Gentiles are probably coming into the church, and part of his agenda is to say that this is new, but it's not really that new, because it's always sort of been God's intention to draw the Gentiles in. Well, if that really is one of the agenda points of Luke, this marks a very interesting element, which in a sense says to include the Gentiles in God's promises is not in some sense to kind of get rid of basic ideas of what it meant to be a Jew, right? To go and participate in synagogue worship, to be a member of the people of Israel, to keep kosher, to keep the Sabbath, etc. And these are all going to be points of issue, points of controversy as we move through. And one of the things that I feel pretty confident in saying now, having taught through Luke, this is basically my third time kind of moving through most of this material, is that for the most part, the issue is never about whether or not one should keep the Sabbath, but to what end and in what way. And that winds up being sort of those wind up being the parameters of conflict that Jesus oftentimes has with his opponents. So that'll be something we'll bring up again. And here again, we see sort of Jesus and his bona fides as a pious Jew on display. So the next thing then, and I'll stop here at the end here in just a second before we transition to the next scene, is just to kind of move through in verses 17 to the end. So, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So there's just a couple things to say about these verses in a generalized sense, and then I want to kind of contextualize them a little bit more in terms of sort of where they come from in Isaiah. Number one is this kind of scene is sort of tantalizing for trying to figure out, well, how, like, what was a synagogue service actually like? So like, and we kind of have some ideas about that. There were prayers offered. There's often a meal. There's typically a reading of some sort, and some kind of like meditation, homily, sermon kind of thing that would have had songs would have been sung. So we know some of that, but like, there's other questions like, when they're handing him the scroll, is there like a set reading that he's supposed to read? We just don't know that offhand, but I just think that's kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind, just in terms of the historical practice that Jesus himself would have been a component of. Now, the actual text that Jesus reads, there's two elements that are important. The first one is not as important, I think, as the second one, but that's simply that this comes out of Isaiah 61, but it's been slightly altered with the addition of a portion of Isaiah 58, verse 6. So there's some sort of a collection here, precisely how that's the case, if that was actually in the actual scroll, or if Jesus reads a portion of it and out of memory includes the other portion, or if it's possible that maybe this is the Aramaic, or what was often called a Targum, which sometimes might have included a little additions. None of that stuff is kind of fully understood, just so that there's more than just Isaiah 61 at play here. But what I do think is important, and what I think becomes important later on as we move into the second half of the scene, is that Jesus chooses to omit a component in Isaiah 61, which is that this day of Jubilee, and I'll talk about this in just a moment, in which the captives are being set free, the unhealthy are being made healthy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was also in Isaiah 61 described as a day of God's vengeance. And Jesus chooses to leave that out of his quote. And I'm going to come back to why I think that's important in just a minute, because there's a very particular target that the day of God's vengeance is aimed at. And Jesus seems all kind of along the way to be interested in undermining the idea of that. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Just kind of put a pin in that. All right, so what can we say about Isaiah 61, realizing that there's a little bit of 58 verse 6 brought in? The first thing, and I think this is one of the things that makes this such a compelling, interesting scene, is Jesus here is taking up an earlier tradition, which itself was taking up an earlier tradition. So Isaiah 61 is what we could describe as a prophetic interpretation of Leviticus 25. You may know what Leviticus 25 contains, or maybe not, but basically it is the place where you would turn to learn about the day of Jubilee, or it's not the day, but the year of Jubilee, which was sort of a culminating version, like the big screen version, I guess we might say, of the Sabbath regulations. So the use of the terminology, right, that we find at the very end in verse 19 gives us a clue that because the year of the Lord's favor is the year of Jubilee. And so without going into a great amount of detail, basically what happens is that in the prophets, and Isaiah is not alone here, though he is one of the great exemplars, as they began to think about the end of exile, they started to talk about it through the language of Jubilee. Like they looked back into Leviticus and they heard about these prescriptions of the law and what those meant in the context of Leviticus 25 was a kind of moment of social reset within the people Israel. And so when you're thinking about the end of exile, that actually translates pretty well. And so Isaiah 61 is really an excellent example of this. It's not the only one, but certainly the one that was, that Jesus seems to have been drawn to. So what are the things that we hear about in the Jubilee prescriptions? If we were to look at Leviticus 25 and kind of taking in mind the later kind of massaging of this in a kind of even broader sense from the prophetic tradition's perspective. Well, first and foremost are the very practical things of releasing those who were held in slavery. And that slavery could be forced slavery, or it could have been a slavery in which you sold yourself into bondage or debt. It also meant returning land, right? So every Hebrew was supposed to have access to land. Remember, in a sense, like this is a kind of attempt to reset a social situation in which inequity and injustice has created, more and more difficulties for people. And so every 7 years, or excuse me, every 50 years, there was supposed to be a fundamental reset of this. And then there was, of course, supposed to be a Sabbath for the land itself. So if we took all this together and not just these kind of very specific, concrete recommendations, but we sort of boiled them down to the way that they wind up being used in the prophets, in a sense, you get this idea of it's really a modern Jewish idea of tikkun olam, which simply means world repair, right? So it refers to the work of making whole the lives of people who otherwise are dispossessed or disinherited. And so I think we're going to kind of see some of that as we move through. So in a sense, what Jesus is saying, and we're going to hear this in just a minute, and I'm kind of foreshadowing, or maybe even jumping the gun, is that Jesus understands his ministry in some sense as initiating God's great jubilee, God's great release. And so this was why I kind of began with this question: what does it mean to you to be set free by Jesus? Because Jesus himself seems to have understood what he was doing in this way. This also clearly plays into something that I've mentioned before, and that now we're going to find demonstrated, certainly from here on out, through much of the rest of Luke, that the notion of being saved or salvation is both a spiritual and a material experience. It has religious or political or economic or social ramifications as much as it has spiritual ramifications. Now, that's not the case every single time, but it certainly is the case more often than not. And so I think those are important things to kind of keep in mind. One of the things, of course, that this Jubilee, the questions that it raises, and I want you to think here about the people. I mean, think about the people who loaned the money out, and the people who had a lot of the land, right, around the time that a Jubilee would have come around. And from what we can tell by all evidence, this was very rarely, if ever, actually practiced. So that tells you something. And I'm not saying it was not practiced because it's impossible. I'm simply saying because of the threat, in a sense, that it kind of represented. But it raises a central question, which is, where exactly do you put your trust? Where are your allegiances, right? So is your allegiance with the your possessions and the practices as of the world, right? That's just the rules by which the game have to be played, et cetera, et cetera. Or is it with this other vision? And I think what we're going to find as we move through the story of Jesus is that he is always pushing that question of, where is your allegiance? Are you willing to actually gamble with the way that God is calling you to gamble, right? To kind of step into a life that essentially is risky. Because if Jubilee had been followed, it would have been a profoundly disruptive social experiment, no doubt about it. But maybe it would have been for the best, right? So anyway, this is all sort of in the background, in the backdrop. And I think if we take Jesus seriously with his use of this, kind of appropriating this as sort of the flagship statement for his ministry, well, now you start to understand why his ministry, in a sense, is so disruptive and is such a source of controversy, because some people can hear this good news and some people can't. And sometimes the people who can't, the reason they can't is because it sounds like bad news, right? So you can kind of see why perhaps there would be resistance. Not entirely, but at least it makes plausible that. All right. So last thing then, the comment is simply this comment about Jesus's ministry, right? That that what he's going to do, and this is what we will see. We won't be able to follow every single scene of this, but here Jesus says that this is what he's about. And I tell you, if you started reading right after verse 30, you would literally see him doing precisely the things that this text says that he is going to do, right? He's going to be proclaiming good news. He's going to be setting people free. He's going to be healing people, et cetera, et cetera. So this sets up who he is, what he's about, while the things that come after are going to set up, are going to kind of demonstrate that, in fact, he's true to that word. All right, let me stop for a second before we turn to the second half of the story and we hear about the local townspeople's response to these words from Jesus. Comments, questions, thoughts?
What would the reaction of the people have been to Jesus' statement, the statement?
Well, we're going to find that out.
Oh, okay. All right, good. I'll wait.
Yeah, we're about to find out what the particular people in the town of Nazareth respond. And I think we want to realize that that's not everybody's response, but it is a response from a certain angle.
Yeah.
And I'll kind of highlight that as we move through here in just a minute. Other comments or questions? All right. Excuse me. Well, can I have a volunteer who is willing to read the second half of our story?
I can do it.
Okay.
And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.'" And he said, "Truly, I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown." But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of town, led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. I guess this answers Linda's question.
That's right. That's right. And it does. It certainly sets it up, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's walk through this a little bit. So the first thing just I want to note is sort of the initial back and forth, and I will say, at least I am going to say that verse 22, I think it's probably the most difficult here to interpret, but that kind of what comes after it does seem to shed some light on some of what's going on in that verse. So number one is just verses 20 and 21, right? So he rolls up the scroll, right? Gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." So in a way, actually it's kind of interesting because it's sort of a typical, you roll up the scroll, right? The passage gets read and then someone offers a commentary. I mean, that's essentially what we're having go on here. In this case, though, and I think you get this particularly in that second sentence in verse 20, the eyes of all in the synagogue are fixed on him. Like it's just the amount of anticipation of this moment is profound. And here there are two things that I think are worth keeping in mind. I'm going to come back to a couple of these too and really hammer them home. Number one, we've already heard in a couple of places prior to this that stories about Jesus are starting to spread, and that he's going to synagogues, and that people are speaking very well of him. All right. So that's number one. Number two, this is Jesus's hometown. And I think we can, with a decent amount of, validity, say that those stories have probably filtered into Nazareth. And so their sense of being fixed on him, number one, has to do with the stories that have preceded him. But number two, with the fact that he's a son of Nazareth. He's not just some traveling prophet who's coming through town that they've heard of and they kind of maybe know who he is. No, he is someone who grew up in their midst, which we get, of course, in that comment in verse 22, that this is Joseph's son. So the scene is crackling with anticipation. And what Jesus essentially says, when he says that today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing, this is a kind of circumlocution, which doesn't mean that everything in the verse has come to pass. In a sense, it means it's beginning to come to pass, right? So the meaning I think we can say is that the promises of Isaiah are now taking on flesh in the ministry of Jesus, who is the one anointed with the Spirit. And we're going to see that start to unfold almost immediately after this scene. So just kind of keep that in mind. As I mentioned before, verse 22, I think is a difficult verse to interpret. So just let me read this. All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, is not this Joseph's son? Why is this hard to interpret? Well, it's hard to interpret because the posture of the community so radically flips when we get down to verse 28, right? When they hear him talking about Elijah and Elisha and their ministry among Gentiles, and these people become enraged, you have to wonder to yourself, and not only that, but you have to actually wonder to yourself, I think all the way back in verse 23, when it says that they're speaking well of him, is this a sincere statement, or is this like a kind of flattery, right? I think sort of in a sense, right? Is this a kind of flattery? So here are some options, right? Is this simply a statement of amazement, right? Is this not Joseph's son? We're speaking well of him. Or maybe it's not only like a statement of amazement, maybe it's something more like, well, this is Joseph's son. Like, he's one of us. And if he's one of us, I mean, that means we're on the front line, right? Look at what we produced. We produced the anointed one. That means clearly our village is awesome. And we're going to be first in line when God realizes God's promises through Jesus, right? I mean, we have a claim on him, right? As good a claim as anyone else. Or is this like, wait a minute, isn't this just Joseph's son? Like, I mean, really? Like he's going to fulfill, so it could be incredulousness, or it could be a mix of all three, right? And that's what I mean by it's not an easy verse to fully get at. It's certainly not in our English translations because it does sort of sound neutral, even positive. Certainly the first part does. But then once you get into that question, you sort of start to realize, oh, there might be something else at stake. And then I think once you turn to verse 23 and moving beyond that, then you realize there's more to these statements than sort of meets the eye. So in verse 23, Jesus says, he said to them, doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, doctor, cure yourself. And you will say, do here in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum. Now, I think personally, again, you can take this or leave it, whatever you want. But I think that verse 23 gives us an indication that Jesus knows that not all is well with these statements, right? I mean, he's already taking up something of a confrontational posture with the expectations that folks have. I tend to think personally that it's probably bullet point number 2, and that certainly is kind of the direction that my interpretation in just a minute is going to go. He offers a proverb, right? And in that proverb is sort of this demand for a sign. And I think we could say here that this might surface that this comment about him being Joseph's son really is about, hey, we're insiders. You need to do for us the things that you did in other places, right? Because we deserve it, because we're your people. And I think you could hear something like that, and that doesn't sound entirely irrational. And one of the commentators that I found particularly useful here put it this way: surely Jesus, the local boy made good, will do for us all the things we've heard that he did elsewhere. And therefore we have the inside track, right? Now, obviously, Jesus is going to explode this expectation, particularly as we move into verse 24 and beyond, to the point where people are going to become enraged at him. And I do think that this, to me, is a way of helping us to understand the shift that clearly happens in this narrative. So let me turn to verse 24. And then, so Jesus makes this statement. No one responds, or at least that's not the way this is set up. He then speaks further. And in that furthering, we get an even more expansive sense that not all is well with the welcome that Jesus has received thus far in Nazareth. So in verse 24, and he said, truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. Now, this is certainly a general truth, but it also, I think, has a kind of specific meaning in this particular context. In terms of it being a general truth, it's simply the idea that that we often have a hard time hearing the truth through people who are familiar to us, right? It's sometimes actually easier to hear the truth from folks who are outsiders as opposed to folks who are insiders. And that clearly is one of the meanings of this parable. But I think in this particular case, there's a specific meaning here, which is that these folks do not accept Jesus because they do not truly understand what Jesus is about, right? They do not understand the depth of his ministry, nor certainly do they understand the expansiveness of his vision, which is a vision that is going to go beyond healing and repairing the people Israel to include healing and repairing all people, right? The Gentiles, in a sense. And I think this becomes demonstrable in the two examples that Jesus offers, right? When he appeals to Elijah and Elisha, this is not so much about whether or not you have accepted Jesus per se. It is rather about God's intention of bringing all people in. That really is what is at stake here. So turning then to verse 25, and I'll read from 25 down to 27. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel at the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow at Zarephath and in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. Now, just keep in mind in verse 26, 28, what Jesus has just said was enough to make these people flip out. Okay? So why do these two examples make people flip out? And there's a couple of reasons. I think the most explicit reason is that these stories challenge the insider assumptions that the people at Nazareth are functioning with. And this is also a very, very important, this idea of challenging the insider assumptions of religious people, of people who are ethnically Jewish or whatever within the frame that Jesus encounters them. This is a big component of Jesus and the story of Jesus. So this is going to be something that's going to come up again and again as it shows up here at the very beginning. So what could we say? We could say something like the people at Nazareth, they expect special treatment. And they expect that special treatment based on a number of assumptions, right? Number one, they're Jews, right? They're God's people, they're Israel. Number two, because they're God's people, Israel, they have received the promises. The promises are made to them. And then number three, of course, is the fact that Jesus is one of their own. So they feel like they have a pretty good claim, like a pretty good legal claim to getting special treatment from Jesus, to getting him to do the things that perhaps in his hometown that he might have done in another place. What we're going to see, though, is that Jesus operates differently, right? It's not that he rejects the people of Israel. That's not the case at all. It's rather he rejects the presumption, right, of insider-outsider status. That's what he's ultimately going to tear down, and that's going to happen again and again. The two stories then that he offers are both stories of prophets being sent not to insiders, but rather to outsiders. And it's not just any outsiders. I think this is really important. It's not just that Elijah is sent to, let me see here, someone who lives in Zarephath and Sidon. No. Elijah is sent to a woman, and not just any woman, a widow, right? Someone who would have, by all accounts in a patriarchal society, been considered less than, and certainly whose existence would have been precarious. And it's not just that Elisha is sent to any Syrian. No, he's sent to a leper. So these are not just Gentiles. They're also like the outsider of Gentiles in a sense, right? Like, so it pushes the boundary and then pushes it even further if you really sit with the imagery that Jesus is working with. This then brings back in that question: why does Jesus drop out the portion of Isaiah 61 that talks about the day of God's vengeance? And I think this is actually a pretty compelling explanation. Again, take it or leave it. But one explanation is that in popular understanding, the object of God's vengeance was understood primarily to be Gentiles, right? That when God brought Jubilee, release, restoration, etc., to Israel, that meant bad news for the Gentiles, because they had been the oppressive forces. So what does Jesus do? He kind of sets that aside. And in a sense, he said, no, I'm coming to set free not only my people, but all people. Right. And so that could be, I think, to me, at least within the economy or the sort of the structure of this passage, I think it has a lot to offer it. So as I say here, so Jesus says to this, no, the good news is not just for some, but rather it's for all. And this then elicits a response from the people of Nazareth. Now, as we move through the Gospels, I want to make clear that as we move through the Gospels, we are going to see this similar dynamic, but oftentimes it's going to play out between Jesus and the religious authorities, who were sometimes called scribes, sometimes called Pharisees, sometimes called lawyers, sometimes called Sadducees, right? But they're people with power. And that's an even better, in a way, I don't know, emblem or contrast, because people with power are clearly insiders. In our case in Nazareth, things are a little bit more muddled, right? Because it's probably common people as well as the powerful or whatever. But this is a pattern that's going to show up again and again as we kind of move through the life of Jesus. So what do? Well, we know what they do, right? When they heard this, and all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. I love that phrasing. I'm sorry. And then I love the way it's followed up. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. So, the response, right? They might have misunderstood what Jesus was about, but to some extent, they clearly understood the sort of insulting implications of his response to them. So they did not necessarily understand what Jesus was about, but they definitely understood the implications of his statements, and therefore had determined that they were going to throw him off a cliff. Which, by the way, some commentators mention that throwing someone off a cliff is stage one to stoning them to death. And so the idea being that somehow in their mind, Jesus has committed blasphemy was a possible reading, but I don't know for sure if I completely agree with that, but that's an option that's out there in terms of interpretation. What can we say about this? I think we can say we're kind of hearing something that we've already heard, and we're definitely hearing something that we're going to hear. And what I mean by that is that in the Gospel of Luke, we have already heard that the extraordinary, profound good news that Jesus embodies and brings is also going to be a source of controversy. If we go back to Simeon and his proclamation or his words said over the baby Jesus, he says that his ministry is going to lead to the rising and falling of many, which means it's not going to be uniformly accepted. It's not going to be uniformly embraced, and that therefore a conflict is going to be, a part of his controversy, is going to be a part of his ministry. And obviously we know that that's also the case as we're going to move forward, because that conflict is going to reach a fever pitch and end in Jesus's execution by crucifixion. All right, let me stop there for a second. And I've given you a lot to think about. I'm going to unshare for just a sec, just to kind of get so I can see people's faces, and we can talk through a little bit of this, and then we'll jump back in and do the next set of verses here in just a minute. So what are some comments, thoughts, questions?
So the crowd would have all known what he was talking about when he brings up the illustration of Elijah, right? And Elisha.
They clearly discern the contours of what he's saying. I think that's right. It is interesting that there are these places in the Gospels where people don't get it and don't get it and don't get it. and then all of a sudden they do get it, and it makes them so mad. And so there are other places like that. So I think this is one of those kind of places.
I love them just walking through them, walking through their midst. What a great.
Right. And you could, I mean, you could just say, in a sense, like, it just isn't his time yet.
Right.
I mean, eventually the crowd is going to lay their hands on Jesus,
Right.
but not yet. Right. He has things to do first.
Throughout his ministry, people seem to want to go for the magic, the cures, the physical, mental, whatever cures, or water into wine, or whatever it happened to be, making blind people see. That seems to have been more their focus rather than the spiritual things. Is showing them the kingdom of God and steering them toward that. That seems to have been played second fiddle to the cures.
Yeah, I think absolutely. There's actually a really wonderful place later on up in, I think it's like late chapter 16 up into 17. It's the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. And without kind of unpacking the whole thing, basically the rich man is like, please, Abraham, please send Lazarus back to my brothers. And Abraham says, well, but your brothers have Moses and the prophets, which basically means they should know what to do. They should know how to live. And he says, no. But they will believe if someone rises from the dead. And he's like, no, they won't. They won't believe. And a lot of this as we go through is going to be about the fact that it's literally Micah 6:8. Oh man, you know what is right, what the Lord has told you, right? Which is to seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. Like, that's the basic contour, and it's just fundamentally forgotten. And sometimes, it's hidden over in miracles, like a desire for miracles, this, that, or the other. But I think that's right, Jim. It kind of connects to that deep, deep sense of you know what to do, and you know what is right. So do it, essentially.
I don't know. I think it speaks to the fact that we're sheep, and if you're blind, you can't work, you can't eat, your life is pretty miserable, and you kind of just want some relief in this world. And if someone can literally come in and perform a miracle on you, then who is that person that can do that? I don't know. I think there's a lot to be said for our sheepiness.
Sure. Yeah, and I don't think this has to take away from that basic human desire, in a sense. But yeah, but there is a definite conflict around the need and desire for a sign, and Jesus's refusal to give one except the sign of his life.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, but the other thing I was thinking about is, but what was it about Jesus that they knew that they could touch his garment and be healed, or they could just take someone and lower them into a room? I mean, there was something about Jesus that was so amazing that they wanted to touch him for healing because they knew he could do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And those become moments of real faith and real trust, and risk. And I plan to hit on a couple of those stories that you just missed as we kind of move through together. I really love, especially the one where the woman touches his garment, because it's one of the great places where the gospel stories make Jesus passive, because he's almost always active. He's always the one engaging, he's always the one talking, he's always the one acting. And that's one of those places. There's a couple of different places, but that one, there's another one in Mark where he is astonished by someone else, which I think is just such a beautiful like commentary on his humanity, and also maybe kind of holistically about the gospel even more broadly.
Yeah, when I think about, there was, I didn't want to follow Jesus, as I've told you, but I mean, it's the same story for, me and some other Jewish people I know, that there was something about Jesus that was the truth, that was so powerful that we were willing to leave whatever it was in our world that we love to follow him.
Yeah.
So those
Amen.
stories to me mean a lot.
Amen. Other comments,
Yeah.
other questions or thoughts?
What, Linda?
I just wanted to thank you for saying that, Deb. We have to be reminded of that.
Well, I mean, it's true. I mean, we all give up so much to follow Jesus at some point in our life. And what is it about him being the light, the truth, the way, the everything, our Messiah, the person who sets us free, that we are willing to do all those things? I'm done.
Any other thoughts or comments?
I read ahead a little bit, and it seems like the crowd, so to speak, is the only body of people that weren't exactly set free in this chapter.
The crowd
At the synagogue.
Oh,
In
you
this-
mean in the
sen-
context of,
Yes, in the sense that they couldn't understand the message that they were given,
Yeah.
whereas some of the other people could accept it in the healing process. And for them, in some ways, they're somewhat of a dead end, so to speak.
yeah, it's interesting. So there's a lot of these places where, so Jesus will be talking to his disciples, right? Or he'll be talking to the crowd, or he'll be talking to the religious authorities, the Pharisees. And I mean, obviously, particularly with the religious authorities, they primarily are cast in the negative, but there are a couple of exceptions to that. The crowd is more a mixed thing. I think there are places where the crowd loves Jesus, understands what Jesus is about, is there for Jesus, wants to hear, etc. But then there are other places where they don't understand. And so I think this is one of those mixed places, right? Where the community as a whole, Nazareth, which I think we have to imagine is made up of people from a whole strata, a variety of strata of in terms of social sort of where they would be located, would be included in that.
I'm trying to recall, does Jesus ever get back to Nazareth again in his
No.
history? No, I don't think he does.
No.
So they kind of cooked their own goose that time by carrying him to the edge of the cliff and all that.
Right.
So he
Right.
might have gone back and done a few things for him.
Well, maybe. I mean, I don't know. I don't know that that's the purpose of the story, but yeah, maybe. You never know. All right, let me shift us. I'll reshare my screen. That was great conversation there. And we will jump in. I need a volunteer who's willing to read our next set of verses here.
I've got it.
Okay.
He went down to Capernaum, a city in Galilee, and was teaching them on the Sabbath. They were astonished at his teaching because he spoke with authority. In the synagogue, there was a man who had the spirit of an unclean demon, and he cried out in a loud voice, "Let us alone. What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." When the demon had thrown him down before them, He came out of him without having done him any harm. They were all amazed and kept saying to one another, "What kind of utterance is this? For with the authority and power, he commands the unclean spirits, and out they come." And a report about him began to reach every place in the region.
Okay. So interestingly, I don't have a comment about this on the outline, but it is worth noting that the people in Nazareth say, "Hey, you should do the things in our town that you did in Capernaum." But the way that Luke tells the story, Jesus hasn't been to Capernaum yet, but all of a sudden now he's in Capernaum, right? So it's kind of an interesting way of just thinking about the connection of what they wanted, what they were looking for, etc. In this case, of course, it's not as forced, right, as the kind of Nazareth where they're begging him to do it. Whereas in the Capernaum scene, it kind of pops up in a sense more is kind of a way maybe we want to think about it. So verses 31 through 39, and we're only going to do 31 through 37 here. But they definitely connect to what just came before. And of course, they would flow into what comes after. We're going to skip a few verses. This is one of those first places that we want to note that. We also could, what are the connection points? Well, first of all, both the scene in Nazareth and now in Capernaum, these are scenes that take place in the synagogue. They're linked, obviously, by Jesus's words about Capernaum. And I think here, and this is where I wish, obviously, I wish we had time to go through every single verse, but I would suggest to you that basically from chapter 4, verse 31, up to about the middle of chapter 6, we get one example after another of Jesus doing exactly what he said he was going to be doing in the Isaiah text. So if the Nazareth scene is the proclamation of the good news, these later scenes are sort of little vignettes in which, what is Jesus doing? He's going around announcing, freedom to the captives, setting people free, healing people of diseases, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how I think these kind of things fit together. And then we kind of get this visitation from John's disciples, I think somewhere around in chapter 6, that kind of marks a nice kind of bookend to this section. The second thing I want to note is this term here. This is the Greek word exousia, which basically means power or authority. And the issue here, as in other places, all the way up through into chapter 6, by the way, because John comes to ask, like John sends his disciples to ask, are you the one? Which is essentially, are you the one endowed with power and authority to enact, God's Jubilee? All these scenes, in a sense, deal with this question of Jesus's power, right? Remember, of course, we've already heard that he is anointed with the power of the Spirit to do his ministry. He was driven out into the wilderness, but he's also driven into his ministry, in a sense, by the power of the Spirit. And one of the interesting things, I think, at least in our scene here, is if we just kind of sort of read this in a sort of somewhat flat sense, in verse 32, it says they were astounded at his teaching because he spoke with authority. And that authority is so, expansive, influential, that it produces a response by someone in the audience who is, quote unquote, possessed by demonic powers. So that's what I mean there, that his proclamation of the good news is so powerful that it elicits a convicted response, right? And this, of course, is in contrast to the earlier scene in Nazareth, where the response is one of revolt, effectively, to Jesus's ministry. So once we turn to 33 through 35, this is kind of the scene essentially with the unclean spirit. In the synagogue, there was a man who had the spirit of an unclean demon, and he cried out with a loud voice, "Let us alone. What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." When the demon had thrown him down before them, he came out of him without having done him any harm. All right, so a couple of comments here. This is our first, aside from his encounter, his confrontation essentially with Satan in the wilderness, this is really the first place where we get a kind of confrontation of Jesus with demonic powers. And it's in the context of his preaching the good news, of his speaking with authority. And so the preaching of the good news and the confrontation with demonic powers, in a sense, these two things are melded together. And that's kind of what we're going to see as we move through the whole story. So who are these demonic powers? Like, what can we say about this, and how Luke, how the ancient world, how Jesus perhaps conceptualized these things? The first thing is that scripture doesn't really give us a theory of origin. There's little passages here and there. And by scripture here, I mean the scriptures that we contain within the canon. You might be able to turn to texts outside of the canon and find more material to work with, like, the book of First Enoch, Second Enoch, maybe the book of Fourth Ezra, some of those kind of books that give you a little bit more in terms of like almost like a demonology. But kind of scripture itself, it's pretty vague in terms of exactly where they come from. But it's not vague, even if it's vague about where they come from, it is not vague about the threat that they represent, right? They clearly represent forces of evil that are beyond human beings to control, right? Human beings, they can try to withstand these powers, but essentially they're no match for them. The only thing that's a match for them is God and God's power, God's reign, which of course is embodied in Jesus. And so God, in a sense, has to step in and confront these powers. Human beings, though, even though they are beyond their control, they are not immune to the negative effects of these powers. And so, as I say here, that the relationship to human beings is one that's fundamentally destructive, psychologically, spiritually, physically, and socially. And so people need to be released from these powers. They need to be set free from them, whatever it is that they represent. Whether you are working with a demonology that tells you that there are actual little spirits around that like hide in different places, or if you have a different conception where when you think about this, it's like, ideologies or whatever, or maybe it's some combination of all of them together. No matter what, these are understood as being powers that are beyond human control, that clearly dehumanize human beings, right? They make them fundamentally almost animal-like, and that's what we're going to hear in certain kinds of spaces and places. Last thing, of course, is to just reiterate what I said, I think I suppose under bullet point, like sub bullet point number 2 there, which is that the work of God's kingdom, of God's Jubilee, is precisely to overthrow these powers, right? So the work of freeing the oppressed and the work of release, et cetera, it certainly has a material connotation and meaning, but it goes beyond that, right? And it also clearly has a spiritual connotation and meaning. And that spiritual connotation and meaning is not just about me and my individual sins. It's about the way that the power of sin oppresses me, right? And the power of sin oppresses you, and the power of sin can seep into and oppress our community, our communal relations, etc. So the work that Jesus is about is, in a sense, fundamentally confrontational with these powers, right? So I think that's important to remember, and that's something that's also going to show up. The second thing is that there is an expectation. Let's see. In verse 34, it says, "Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." this language is associated with the final day of the Lord, right? So the day of the Lord was this kind of shorthand for the day of God's appearing, the day of judgment, and the day of setting free and giving new life, which meant, of course, because it's a day of judgment, the destruction of the demonic powers. So this demonic power essentially recognizes, in a sense, that with the coming of Jesus, God's kingdom has come in a new and profound way. All right. So there's a kind of confession here, or profession, in a sense here, of the truth of who Jesus was, who Jesus is, that is in some ways more penetrating than almost any of the other confessions that we've heard, certainly from human beings, though we don't want to discount the earlier confessions of people like Elizabeth and Simeon and Anna and the shepherds and of course the angels, etc. And I think this fact, of course, is why, and I found this particularly compelling as an argument for why Jesus commands the power to be silent. And the reason he commands the power to be silent is that this power may know the truth, but there's still a false witness, right? So Jesus is not about to accept the false witness of a demonic power. This theme appears again once we get up into Acts chapter 16, and there's this whole scene where Paul is and a couple of his compatriots are ministering in a city, and there's a young woman who has a kind of demonic spirit inhabiting her, but she uses it to tell fortunes, and she's walking around following Paul, telling people, these people are anointed by God Most High and are telling you the way of salvation. And Paul turns around and commands her to be silent, and so whatever the power was that she had leaves her. And I think it's the same basic idea, which is that God will not accept the testimony of someone who not only who speaks falsely, but who is false. I loved one of the commentators that I found particularly useful here was Justo Gonzalez, who's a Cuban-born theologian, Methodist, and he mentions here tyrants, dictators, and oppressors who support the preaching of Christianity are still tyrants, dictators, and oppressors, and therefore their witness is false. And so the idea is that right words must be accompanied by right action. And I think this gives us at least a compelling or logical understanding of why Jesus would have silenced this power. Of course, it's followed immediately. The confession of this profession by the demonic power is then followed by a different profession, which Jesus does not silence, right? And this is in verse 36. They were all amazed and kept saying to one another, what kind of utterance is this? For with authority and power, he commands the unclean spirits, and out they come. And so, in a sense, like we have a contrast, effectively, with this scene in Capernaum now, which echoes us back to Nazareth, but also has a kind of a mini echo with the figure who's just been set free from the demonic power. And that is that now we hear actually a truthful testimony, even if it's partial, right? They don't necessarily claim to know precisely who Jesus is, but they do find themselves in a posture where they have to confess the truth, right? That Jesus has power and authority, and that power and authority has to be obeyed. Even the spirits obey when he commands. So he indeed, in a sense, is the one who comes to destroy the work and power of darkness. And that action is, to a certain extent, linked up with expectations about God's final work of salvation. And therefore, I think we can start to understand why the anticipations, and the expectations of other people who are going to encounter Jesus grow and grow and grow and grow. That is, we're not just dealing with a simple sage or healer or prophet or preacher with Jesus. We're dealing with someone who seems to be of a different order, right? And by that I mean is far superior to those other potential orders. All right, last comment, last thing to do here tonight, and then I'll stop and we can kind of have a conversation, is just to recapitulate this early portion of Jesus's ministry. I've skipped over the last few verses of chapter 4, which talk about him going out and being concerned to preach the kingdom of God to other people, which I think reinforce the idea that he is not, that Jesus has come, but he has not come to be our possession, right? Certainly not in his ministry. He has work to do. And so in 16 to 44, we give a kind of base, we see a kind of basic outline of Jesus's ministry, right? He comes to preach the good news. He comes to proclaim release, to setting free the captives, to giving sight to the blind, etc. And this is essentially what we wind up seeing as we move through. We also, of course, see that this really remarkable, amazing ministry is not without controversy, right? That's the other thing that we see. So what does that mean? What can we say? Jesus is the anointed servant of Isaiah, empowered by the Spirit to be Yahweh's chosen instrument, right? Releasing us from the bondage of sin, as well as the powers that enslave us. As I've already mentioned, Jesus's message, the good news, is not without controversy. And one of those places we saw in Nazareth itself, right? The promises of Jubilee were given to Israel, but they were not meant only to be for Israel, but rather through Israel for the nations. And this is, of course, what is not necessarily well received as they attempt to throw him off the hill. And then lastly, the entwining here at the beginning of Jesus, particularly with this scene that we just did with the man who set free from a demonic power, we have the entwining of word and deed, which of course is going to be central to discipleship, right? It's not enough to say something, you must also do something. And that we see that wind up being interconnected already in the life of Jesus himself. So the public inauguration of Jesus' ministry then is immediately followed by actions, right? He's come, he announces liberation, and then what does he do? He starts going about doing some liberating. And that's something that will kind of flow out in more and more marked ways as we move through the rest of the narrative. All right, let me stop share. Yeah.